In January of 1900, the automobile was little more than a curiosity, a noisy, unreliable contraption that scared horses and amused children. Most Americans had never seen one in person. By December of that same year, over 48,000 people would crowd into Madison Square Garden just to catch a glimpse of these machines, and the automobile industry would never be the same. This is the story of the early automobile shows and salons, and how a series of exhibitions transformed American transportation forever. Along the way, we will encounter visionary entrepreneurs, engineering marvels, fierce rivalries, and a nation on the brink of a mechanical revolution. So, let us begin. But first, what exactly was the American automobile industry like before these shows changed everything? Now, to understand why these exhibitions mattered so much, you have to understand just how chaotic the early automobile business really was. In the late 1890s, there was no automobile industry to speak of. What existed was a scattered collection of tinkerers, bicycle mechanics, and wealthy hobbyists, each building machines in small workshops and barns across the country. There were no standards, no agreed-upon designs, no way for the average person to even know what an automobile was supposed to look like. The thing is, most Americans in 1899 had never seen a functioning automobile, not in person anyway. They might have read about them in newspapers. They might have seen illustrations of those strange European contraptions that rich people drove around Paris. But the idea of a horseless carriage was, for most people, somewhere between science fiction and carnival attraction. And here's where it gets interesting. The few automobiles that did exist in America were wildly different from one another. Some ran on steam, some ran on electricity, some ran on gasoline, some had 3 wheels, some had 4, some steered with a tiller like a boat, others had something resembling a steering wheel. There was no consensus on what an automobile should be because nobody really knew yet. Into this chaos stepped a group of entrepreneurs who understood something crucial. Before you could sell automobiles to the American public, you had to show them what automobiles were. You had to let people see these machines, touch them, sit in them. You had to create desire for something that most people didn't even know they wanted. The first significant American automobile show took place in 1900, and honestly, it was a gamble. The organizers had no idea if anyone would actually show up. They had no idea if the public would be fascinated or terrified. They had no idea if these machines would even work reliably enough to be displayed without embarrassing everyone involved. But they did it anyway. And what happened next would reshape American industry. Picture this. Madison Square Garden, New York City, November 1900. The building had hosted prize fights, circuses, political conventions. But nothing quite like this. The organizers had transformed the space into something between a museum and a carnival. Electric lights illuminated rows of gleaming machines. Banners hung from the rafters. The air smelled of polish and possibility. And the automobiles themselves? They were spectacular. Not because they were particularly advanced by later standards, but because they represented the cutting edge of human ingenuity in that moment. Each manufacturer had brought their finest work: steam cars with polished brass fittings, electric vehicles with elegant leather interiors, gasoline automobiles with engines that actually ran, at least most of the time. The public response was overwhelming. People lined up for hours just to get inside. They crowded around each display, asking questions, marveling at the engineering, trying to understand how these machines actually worked. For many visitors, this was their first encounter with the automobile, and the manufacturers understood that first impressions mattered. I mention this because the early shows were not just about displaying products, they were about education. The manufacturers had to explain basic concepts that we take for granted today. What is a carburetor? How does a spark plug work? Why does this machine need water and that one need gasoline? The show floors became classrooms and the salesmen became teachers. The 1900 show attracted attention from across the country. Newspapers sent reporters. Magazines commissioned illustrations. The coverage was extensive and enthusiastic. America, it seemed, was ready to fall in love with the automobile, or at least curious enough to learn more. But the early shows also revealed something troubling about the infant industry. The machines on display were expensive, really expensive. A basic automobile cost more than most Americans earned in a year. Some cost more than a house. The crowds at Madison Square Garden might admire these machines, but very few could actually afford to buy one. The manufacturers understood this limitation, but they also understood something else. The people who could afford automobiles were exactly the kind of people who attended exhibitions at Madison Square Garden. Wealthy industrialists, society figures, the American elite. These shows were not aimed at the masses, not yet. They were aimed at the people with money to spend on the latest technological marvel, and spend they did. Orders placed at the 1900 show exceeded all expectations. Manufacturers who had struggled to sell a handful of machines suddenly found themselves with waiting lists. The automobile show had proven its worth as a sales tool. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The success of the first shows created a feedback loop that accelerated the entire industry. More sales meant more money for development. More development meant better machines. Better machines attracted more attention at shows. More attention meant more sales. The cycle fed on itself, and the automobile industry began to grow at an extraordinary pace. By 1901, the automobile shows had become annual events. New York remained the flagship, but shows began appearing in other cities: Chicago, Boston, Philadelphia. Each show was bigger than the last. Each attracted more visitors. Each featured more advanced machines. The shows also became battlegrounds for competing technologies. Remember, this was still the era when nobody knew which type of automobile would ultimately dominate. Steam, electric, and gasoline all had passionate advocates, and the shows became the arena where these technologies competed for public attention and customer dollars. Steam automobiles had certain advantages. They were quiet. They were powerful. They had been around longer and felt more familiar to a public that understood steam engines from trains and factories. At the early shows, steam cars often attracted the most admiration. Electric automobiles had their own appeal. They were clean. They were simple to operate. They didn't require the physical effort of cranking a gasoline engine to life. Many observers predicted that electric cars would dominate the future, especially for urban use. And then there were the gasoline automobiles, noisy, smelly, complicated, requiring a fuel that was difficult to obtain in many parts of the country. In 1901, gasoline cars seemed like the long shot. The technology was crude. The engines were unreliable. The whole experience of driving one was, frankly, kind of unpleasant. But the gasoline car advocates had something the others lacked: range. A gasoline automobile could travel farther on a tank of fuel than a steam car on a tank of water or an electric car on a battery charge. And in a country as vast as America, range mattered. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of story. Quick question: where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments, and if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do this every week. All right, back to the shows. Because what happened over the next few years would determine the entire future of American transportation. The automobile shows of the early 1900s became increasingly sophisticated. Manufacturers began to understand that simply displaying machines was not enough. They needed to create experiences. They needed to tell stories about their products that would capture the public imagination. One manufacturer brought a working assembly line to the show floor, demonstrating how their automobiles were built piece by piece. Another created an elaborate diorama showing their car conquering mountain roads. A third hired professional drivers to demonstrate the capabilities of their machines in controlled tests outside the exhibition hall. The competition was fierce, and it pushed everyone to improve. Each year, the machines on display were noticeably better than the year before. Engines became more powerful, bodies became more elegant. Features that seemed like luxuries one year became standard equipment the next. And the public noticed. Attendance at the shows continued to climb. By 1905, the New York Automobile Show had become one of the most anticipated events of the social season. Wealthy families planned their schedules around it. Newspapers devoted entire sections to coverage. The automobile had transformed from curiosity to status symbol. But the shows also served another crucial function. They established standards. When dozens of manufacturers gathered in one place, displaying their products side by side, certain expectations began to emerge. Customers could compare features directly. They could see which innovations were genuinely useful and which were merely gimmicks. The market, through the mechanism of the show, began to impose order on chaos. By 1907, the automobile industry had begun to consolidate around certain basic principles. The steering wheel had replaced the tiller on virtually all machines. 4 wheels had become standard. Gasoline had emerged as the dominant power source, though steam and electric vehicles continued to be displayed for years to come. The shows also became launching pads for legendary automobiles. Manufacturers timed their most important introductions to coincide with major exhibitions. The drama of unveiling a new model before crowds of eager spectators created publicity that money simply couldn't buy. Think about what these shows represented. In an era before television, before internet, before most people had ever seen an automobile in person, the shows were the primary way the public encountered these machines. The impression made at a show could determine the fate of an entire company. A poorly received display could mean bankruptcy. A triumphant debut could establish a manufacturer for decades. The pressure was enormous, and manufacturers responded with increasingly elaborate presentations. Some built miniature racetracks inside exhibition halls. Others created luxurious lounges where potential customers could relax while learning about their products. A few brought celebrity drivers to sign autographs and share stories of racing victories. The shows also reflected the social dynamics of the era. The most expensive automobiles were displayed in prime locations with elaborate decorations and attentive staff. Cheaper models were relegated to less prominent positions. The show floor was, in its way, a map of American society with wealth and status determining placement. And yet the shows also hinted at a more democratic future. As production methods improved and costs began to decline, automobiles gradually became accessible to a broader segment of the population. The shows that had once catered exclusively to the wealthy began to attract middle-class visitors who dreamed of owning their own machines. By 1910, the transformation was remarkable. The automobile had gone from exotic novelty to essential product in barely a decade, and the shows had been central to that transformation. They had educated the public. They had established standards. They had created desire for a technology that most Americans hadn't known they needed. The success of the American automobile shows inspired imitators around the world. The Paris Salon had existed before the American exhibitions, but the American approach to spectacle and salesmanship influenced shows everywhere. The combination of education and entertainment, of technology and theater, became the template for industrial exhibitions across the globe. Now, I should mention something about the people behind these shows. The organizers were not, for the most part, automobile manufacturers themselves. They were entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity in bringing buyers and sellers together. They understood that in a new industry, with no established distribution networks, the show served a crucial economic function. These organizers took significant risks. Renting Madison Square Garden was expensive. Advertising was expensive. Coordinating dozens of competing manufacturers, each with their own demands and egos, was exhausting work. More than one early show nearly collapsed due to financial problems or organizational chaos. But the potential rewards justified the risks. Successful shows generated substantial revenue from admission fees and exhibitor payments. More importantly, they established the organizers as power brokers in the emerging industry. A favorable position at a major show could be worth thousands of dollars in sales, and the organizers controlled those positions. The relationship between manufacturers and show organizers was not always harmonious. Disputes over placement, over rules, over fees were common. Some manufacturers boycotted shows they considered unfair. Others tried to organize competing exhibitions. The politics of the early automobile shows were, honestly, kind of messy. But through all the conflict, the shows continued to grow. By 1912, the New York Automobile Show occupied multiple venues simultaneously. Hundreds of manufacturers displayed thousands of products. The crowds numbered in the hundreds of thousands over the run of the show. The automobile had become central to American life, and the show had become central to the automobile industry. The early shows also documented the rapid evolution of automotive technology. Photographs from 1900 show machines that look almost like motorized carriages. Photographs from 1915 show vehicles that are recognizably automobiles in the modern sense. The transformation happened in public, on show floors, before the eyes of millions of visitors. And the shows captured something else, something harder to quantify. They captured the optimism of an era that believed technology would solve human problems. The automobile promised freedom, mobility, prosperity. It promised to shrink distances and expand possibilities. The shows were temples to that faith in progress. Of course, that faith was not entirely justified. The automobile would bring problems as well as solutions: pollution, accidents, urban sprawl, the reshaping of American cities around the needs of machines rather than people. But in the early 1900s, those problems lay in the future. What existed in the present was possibility. The shows also revealed the competitive dynamics that would shape the industry for decades. By watching which manufacturers expanded their displays and which reduced them, observers could track the health of different companies. The shows were, in a sense, annual report cards for the entire industry. Some manufacturers who dominated early shows would fade into obscurity. Others who started with modest displays would grow into giants. The shows recorded these rises and falls, documenting an industry in constant transformation. By the late teens, the automobile show had become an institution. The annual cycle of shows in major cities was established. The formats were standardized. The relationships between manufacturers, organizers, and the press were well defined. What had started as an experiment had become tradition. And what of the specific individuals who shaped these early shows? The promoters who took the initial risks? The manufacturers who gambled on new technologies? The journalists who covered the exhibitions and shaped public perception? Most of them are forgotten now. Their names appear in old newspapers and trade publications, but few remember their contributions. They were not the inventors or the industrialists whose names we know today. They were the middlemen, the facilitators, the people who brought innovation to the public. But their impact was profound. Without the shows, the American automobile industry might have developed very differently. More slowly, perhaps, more chaotically, certainly. The shows provided structure and momentum during a critical period of growth. The early automobile shows also established patterns that persisted for generations. The annual cycle of anticipation and revelation. The careful management of publicity and secrecy. The theatrical unveiling of new models. The competition for attention and acclaim. These patterns originated in the shows of the early 1900s and continued throughout the 20th century. And the shows reflected something fundamental about American culture, the belief that progress should be celebrated, the faith that new technologies would improve life, the conviction that competition and commerce, properly channeled, would benefit everyone. The automobile shows were expressions of American optimism at its most confident. Now, I want to be clear about something. These early shows were not perfect representations of the automobile industry. They emphasized luxury and novelty over practicality. They catered to wealth rather than need. They promoted consumption in ways that we might view critically today. But they were also genuine achievements. Organizing these exhibitions required vision, coordination, and risk-taking. Making them successful required understanding public desire and finding ways to satisfy it. The early show organizers, whatever their limitations, accomplished something remarkable. By 1920, the automobile had completed its transformation from luxury to necessity. The shows had played their part in that transformation, and they continued to evolve alongside the industry they served. Bigger venues, more elaborate displays, greater spectacle year after year. The legacy of those early shows persists today. Modern automobile exhibitions around the world trace their lineage back to Madison Square Garden in 1900. The formats have changed. The technologies have advanced beyond anything those early pioneers could have imagined. But the basic concept remains the same. Bring the machines to the people. Let them see. Let them dream. Let them desire. And that is the story of the early automobile shows and salons. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more and let me know in the comments, had you heard about these early exhibitions before? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.